Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on NetworksRadio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's me. I'm back again, recording once again ahead of time, but I'm in mid-vacation, and I kind of had to interrupt things because the president went crazy. Now, that sounds like something you could do any day, whether you're on vacation or not. And I've been on vacation before and had the president go crazy, but I mean, he really went crazy this time. And I needed to record some more shows anyway. I got some shows ready for you Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of this week, but I didn't have anything quite ready for Friday. So let's roll this one out on Friday, August 18th, and see where we are. If we're still United States of America, if Donald Trump is still president. I'm betting that he survives at this point, but who really knows? Who can even really tell? As a matter of fact, who can even tell whether we're recording here? Because it looks to me like, for some reason, well, okay, not all of the indicator lights that are supposed to be blinking are blinking, but I'm okay with that. Let's move on and just consider everything to be thumbs up. We don't have Justice here to check, but I'll check before I send him the file to make sure that we got voice recording here. Anyway, so yes, the president went a little bit nuts, maybe a lot bit nuts, and it's time for us to start to catch up on these things. Even though I think we had two relatively relevant shows, considering that we were guessing what might be in the news and dipping into our archives, of course. But I know I think we hit it on Wednesday. It was the Sebastian Gorka show, and a little bit more about him on Thursday. But he's not even the Nazi with whom we are chiefly concerned anymore. That now has moved over to the president himself. But there's so much swirling around this whole, I don't know what to even call it. My tongue wants to go to controversy, but there's no controversy here. There's just Nazis and not Nazis, and it's an easy thing to do. And I think everybody probably by this stage of the game is past the, well, duh, you have to condemn Nazis. When given a choice between Nazi and not Nazi, and you need to condemn somebody, condemn the Nazi. You can't go wrong with that. Trump did it wrong anyway. And in between then and the time this airs, I don't even know what we're going to see. We're certainly seeing a lot of Republicans purport to abandon him on this issue, but who knows whether they'll abandon him on anything else. I don't know if we're probably not going to see any resignations, although that's like the last chance anybody has to redeem themselves from this administration. I doubt very much whether they're going to take it. And in case you were wondering whether or not Ivanka and Jared were going to moderate the president on this one, I mean, if you're still listening to the show, I doubt very much whether that ever really occurred to you as a serious question. Glenn Thrush, who is stuck in the position of having to report for the New York Times, has to say, well, my sources say this, but I don't think even he believed it as he reported it. And probably the best indication of what is really happening here, I'm going to say, came from Ashley Feinberg, who tweeted this. I guess she works for Wired.com, so she was into this as a measurement. This was a good metric for her. She tweeted on the 15th, on Tuesday, as things were melting down. Yeah, about Ivanka pushing for her dad to denounce Nazis more forcefully. We have this news. Apparently, at some point, Marlee Maitland tweeted, it's dated here. So on the 15th, Tuesday, at just after 6 p.m., sent out the tweet, your basic stuff here. America fought secessionists in the Civil War, Nazis and anti-Semites in World War II. Do we blame both sides? The answer is no then and no now, with a little angry face emoji to accompany it. And I guess the very valuable Trump Alert, a Twitter account that I guess monitors Trump-related Twitter activity, and I guess is set to monitor when Trump family members do things on Twitter, has collected the response. Immediately after that, Eric Trump, it notes, has just unfollowed Marlee Matlin. Donald J. Trump Jr. has just unfollowed Marlee Matlin. And in case you were wondering, yes, Ivanka Trump also unfollows Marlee Matlin. And I mean, I don't know why anybody would believe that Ivanka was really going to do anything anyway, but how you believe that she could possibly moderate her father on anything, let alone on this, and do it while being angry with somebody who says, Nazis are a different thing. You don't give shelter to these guys. So, no hope in that. And of course, by the way, they're on vacation, as it turns out. Now, I say that with my voice is dripping with poison in this. I say this as I'm on vacation. But you see, I took the time to check in, even from vacation, and to do my work before I left. How many vacation days? And this is, that's another tweet I saw yesterday. One of the other New York Times reporters just tweeting, White House staffer, serious question. How many vacation days do you get? These assistants to the president keep taking vacations. They took a week off at Passover. They're in Vermont this week. Gee whiz, I was going to help fight Nazis, but I'm, had a previously scheduled vacation. I can't help you with that. That's really not much of a comfort. And of course, just as with issues like Middle East peace, your mind immediately goes to Jared Kushner. Where's Jared Kushner to fix this problem? Why can't Jared Kushner or his converted Jewish wife Ivanka Trump talk Donald Trump out of giving aid and comfort to American neo-Nazis? And the answer is, because they never really did anything. Dad trusts him with stuff he doesn't want to touch, and, maybe with some money things. Here, you want to start a jewelry line? Go ahead. You want to tell me what to do with white supremacists who are my base? I'm the politician here. The politician who can't figure out that he can distance himself from Nazis and still even be coddling his base. But that's, what can I tell you? He hasn't been able to figure that out, and they haven't figured out that they have no influence with him either. It's of course worth a great deal more to them to pretend that they continue to have influence, so they do. Anyway, I didn't actually see the press conference, and normally I don't watch those things anyway, but everybody's reaction to it was so amazing. I was watching on Twitter. I was in the car, not driving, not doing the Armando here. Hey, check out this amazing press conference. He's really going off the rails. Whoa, look out. And that wasn't even me. That was Trump. So I didn't get a chance to watch, but I watched the reaction, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing, except that Donald Trump is president now, and I guess I kind of could believe what I was seeing, but I missed the nuances of it, and I did get to read some transcripts, and I saw some clips, and it was pretty much as crazy as advertised, and the response, likewise, about what we thought we would get out of this. But man, I mean, I really felt compelled to come back and have something to say about this. Well, at the moment I'm in North Carolina. I passed through Tennessee yesterday. I'm in North Carolina at the moment. Hi, everybody. North Carolina in the Asheville area. Beautiful area. Having a fantastic time. Doing all the wonderful activities when it isn't raining on me. And we've had pretty good luck with the weather. And I do read that, well, one, of course, there was the activity in Durham, North Carolina, where they tore down the Confederate monument. More about that in a little bit. And I was pleased to see now that there is a Democratic governor of North Carolina. They know which side they're on with respect to Nazis and Confederates. And sounds like some more monuments will be coming down. I also was pleased to see Baltimore took the easiest way out, took down their Confederate monuments, 4 of them that existed in the city overnight, which I think they could have done in relative peace even during the day in Baltimore, but you never know. By the way, I think all of these monuments, and there are hundreds of them, should come down. I don't think that's any surprise to any of the rest of you. I mean, they're obviously magnets for hate rallies now, and the longer you drag it out, the more time you get to organize these things, and that's not what you want, basically. So I think all of them, if they're going to come down, I think they ought to coordinate us between cities, and they should say everybody's taking them down the same day. If they don't do it overnight in secret like Baltimore did, if you got to take them down during the day, do them on the same day and spread the forces out thin. These guys won't know where to go next. they may just, if they're smart, they'll concentrate all their firepower, and we mean firepower, in one or perhaps two cities so that their numbers can be seen. But if you were taking them down in hundreds of locations on the same day, at best, a dozen people, I mean, maybe in some of the major cities you could get more. And I have a feeling that if people thought that they were going to be, when you think you're going to be one of hundreds, you're encouraged to show up. When you think you're going to be one of perhaps 5 or a dozen, and that there'll be more counter-protesters than protesters, there are a lot of people out there who are going to chicken out of that. And with good reason. It's a smart play. Stay away from it, especially after Charlottesville, when people are going to be on heightened alert. You could actually get your ass kicked pretty good. And we saw a lot of that, too. I mean, in addition to the obvious attacks that we saw or heard about, I was very impressed, actually, by the way that the organizers, the counter-protest to the organizers' press conference the following day went. Armando and I talked a little bit about that, I think, on Monday, and I was, he was impressed with the way they handled it non-violently, although there were, of course, counter-protesters there who did not take the same cue. But I thought that one was handled very, they should be shouted down, and I loved the approach of that one particular activist who, there's more story about him too, by the way, who approached the podium with his hands way up in the air to indicate that there's no violence happening here, but just got in the guy's face and chased him off the scene. That I thought was brilliant. Now, as it happens, he's friends with a number of people that you probably follow on Twitter, and I don't know if I put this story away or not, but he's a UVA graduate himself, now graduated many years ago, but hung around in the neighborhood of Charlottesville post-graduation, and a tireless activist in all sorts of ways. And apparently, though he looked okay after the fact, and then during this protest of the press conference, I'll have to grab you some details about this. He was fine, but apparently later on, he suffered some after effects of having been assaulted in previous fighting on Friday night. Those tiki torches that people were carrying around, it looked like such a joke. Somebody whacked him in the neck with one, and although he walked away from the situation, apparently getting hit that hard in the carotid artery left him injured, and a blood clot formed, and he had a stroke as a result of this. That brilliant counter demonstrator is in the hospital, and there's a significant effort to raise some funds to try and help take care of him, a GoFundMe project. I'll have to go and pick that information up and make sure that we have a link for you, at the very least, in the summary of the show. I'm sorry I didn't set that aside, and I didn't think I was going to get to that, but that's where my mind went this morning. In addition, I did say that there was going to be more about the Confederate monuments that are going to start coming down. If you saw the video, I was interested in the video of the monument coming down in Durham, and as soon as I saw it, I said, that does look kind of funky. That came down a lot easier than I thought, and it looks like kind of a cheesy, cheap monument. And as it turns out, it was, and it turns out there's a real reason behind that. And I saw a tweet about it, and thankfully the guy who was filling us in on the situation via Twitter has since put together an article about it on Quartz. Let's see. Is this the same guy here? Yeah. Okay. I saw it tweeted by Tabor Andrew Bain, who tweets as Tabor. That's written up here by Mark Bain, so I don't know whether that's his. I don't know whether one's a professional name and the other isn't, or is a real name or what. But at any rate, it's written up under the name of Mark Bain, and here on Quartz, where we have been a couple of times, the shoddy manufacturing story behind all those Confederate statues around the U.S. The one in Durham came down real easy, and what I noticed most immediately was as they wrapped some straps around it, some toe straps around it, and just went to pull it down. I thought the statue would tear or break or something, but instead what happened is the pedestal that the statue was attached to came off of the column that this pedestal sat atop, and it really, turns out it was sort of like a grave marker almost. I mean, there's nobody buried there, but something you might see in the cemetery. There was nothing holding the top of the column, which served as a pedestal for this statue, to the column itself. It was just gravity, just sitting on top there. I figure the wind isn't going to blow this thing off, and nobody's going to push it or pull it off because, hell, it's a war monument. Who would do that? Well, they didn't figure on it and stuff, but good. I'm glad that they didn't. And then, of course, it toppled over and it had this enormous weight on its feet, but it hit the ground head first, and then the statue just bent. And that's when everybody realized, oh my God, this thing is hollow. It's not even a solid, statue. It's just this hollow casting thing. What's the story with these cheap, cheesy monuments? And the story turns out to be they're cheap, cheesy monuments. And Mark Bain was the one that brought that to my attention. He writes it up this way. It didn't take protesters much effort to topple a century-old Confederate statue at a rally in Durham, North Carolina yesterday. One protester climbed atop its stone plinth. He's got actual terminology here. Inscribed with, "In memory of the boys who wore gray," and tied a rope around the statue of the Confederate soldier, a symbol of the slave-owning South from the U.S. Civil War, obviously. I mean, I think we all understand that here, but maybe there are some abroad who don't. Then, with a good pull, the crowd, gathered in solidarity with the anti-racist demonstrators who clashed with white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia over the weekend, sent the towering effigy crashing hard to the ground. And it looks like it's just people pulling on it. It's not attached to a truck or anything. Many Americans view these monuments as symbols of ongoing tolerance for white supremacy, and they're still extremely common throughout the U.S., the southeastern U.S. in particular. A recent study by the Southern Poverty Law Center tallied at least 1,500 symbols of the Confederacy in public spaces, concentrated largely in states like Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, where we've all just kind of sort of gotten used to them. There's one in my county out front of the county courthouse. And I remember the first one of these that I saw before I moved to Loudoun County, I think just driving down through Orange, Virginia, and seeing one in front of the Orange County Courthouse and saying, yeah, I guess they have Confederate monuments down here. And it's a little weird. We've just kind of gotten used to it and listened to people say, well, it's heritage, not hate. Yeah. All right, well, the reasons, though, that there are so many of these statues and why they're so easily toppled are one and the same. Many of them were mass-produced in northern foundries and shoddily installed across the American South. A large share of Confederate statues are of nameless, generic soldiers, like the one the protesters took down in Durham. Originally, the tweet about it that caught my eye read, why did the statue go down so easily? Many Lost Cause-era Confederate monuments were mass-produced in the cheapest way possible for mass distribution. And that's basically what happened. Towns erected them in the early 20th century, decades after the Civil War, because their Confederate mythologies helped them justify Jim Crow laws in the South that oppressed black citizens. Tabor Andrew Bain, a librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University, pointed out on Twitter. Interesting, so maybe Mark is his brother. That would be a better explanation than it's a pen name. But I just said I'm confused about it because Tabor was saying on Twitter after this tweet storm, I'm going to write this up somewhere and put it all in one place. And then I looked for it, and I found this, and maybe he made Mark do it. Mark's his little brother, maybe, and he said, I'm going to beat you up if you don't do it. I don't know. Maybe he's not into oppression. Anyway, he's a librarian at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he pointed this all out on Twitter. The statues are often called the Silent Sentinel, the Single Soldier, or something similar, and depict a regular soldier in Confederate uniform staring solemnly into the distance, at ease, with feet spread, a stance called parade rest, according to art historian Lola Arellano Fryer, who wrote about the statues for Hyperallergic. Interesting. Maybe I'll check out that link too. The statues proliferated specifically because they were cheap. To sculpt a statue in marble would have been time-consuming and prohibitively expensive for small towns in the early 1900s, but northern foundries that worked in cast bronze or zinc could churn them out quickly and sell them at much lower costs. Why would the North do this? Money. And, maybe they were still white supremacists too. One of the leading manufacturers was the Monumental Bronze Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Greg, you have to check this out. Which specialized in a cast zinc it called white bronze, a light gray or pale blue color. There's a good example of it in the photo above, and that pale blue probably brings it to mind. Oh, I know what they're talking about. In 2015, the Associated Press dug into the company's history. That's an interesting link, too. It sold life-size statues for just $450 and larger 8.5-foot versions for $750. Commissioning marble or granite statues, meanwhile, would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. It's like going to Walmart. Timothy S. Sedor, who wrote An Illustrated Guide to Virginia's Confederate Monuments, told the Newswire it's less expensive. Sarah Beetham, an art historian at the University of Delaware and an expert on soldier monuments, explained to the AP that as many as half of these citizen soldier statues were the silent sentinel style. Southern citizens felt personally connected to them. They commemorated all Confederate soldiers, including their family members who may have fought for the Confederacy. Because these mass-produced statues were put up on the cheap, they may not even have been firmly anchored to their pedestals, making them easy to pull down. That makes them an attractive target for protesters who want to see them and all they represent removed. Oh, how convenient. And interesting, there's an illustration in the piece here. It looks like a screen capture of several examples of similar monuments made by McNeil Marble Works. And tweeted along with it a tweet of Michael Whitney that says, the Confederate statue toppled today was mass-produced. There are dozens that can be killed the same way, and there's a list here. Makes it very, very easy, doesn't it? I also read something very interesting about the kind of cheap bronze or whatever it is that they were using to make these statues, the sort of a scientific guide to how to get rid of these things. I wonder if I can find this thing very easily. I thought I had it at the ready, but as it turns out, hydrochloric acid, which is actually, it's like super chemically sounding and everything. Ooh, hydrochloric acid. It's apparently quite easy to come by in chemical supply stores or even in common hardware stores. It's the active ingredient under a different name of apparently something you might use to wash cement for whatever reason. And but hydrochloric acid pretty well dissolves the bases of these things. If you were to just splash some around the bottom of these bronze statues, they'll eventually topple over of their own weight, or at least make pulling them down later on that much easier. And as they pointed out, if you can't come up with any hydrochloric acid on your own, it's just as easy for you, if you feel up to it, to just simply use what natural hydrochloric acid you have lying around. That is, if you were to, say, vomit on the base of the statue, that would do the same trick. And eventually, at your own leisure, you could come back and push the thing down with relative ease. I wonder if I can find that, because that was kind of a funny little thread there, too. But anyway, yeah, people still kind of caught up in the statue thing. And it's been amazing watching people who, I don't know, maybe are otherwise educated people. I mean, I did see that Condoleezza Rice at some point said something about, oh, this is terrible because you're erasing history, and that's never a good idea. And it's like, well, I mean, I get, as Simon Malloy put it, well, that's what history was when I was in college. I took history classes, and the professors were like, they just took us to monuments and said, there you go, that's the only history there is. Without statues, stupid, cheap, mass-produced statues that can be pulled down by hand, you'll never really learn history. Okay. Well, I don't think that's really going to cut it for most people, but I don't know what she thought she was defending here. But yeah, I saw there was a political cartoon that was commented on That came out. I think I finally did see that one on Wednesday. Who's the artist here? I don't even know. Branco is the signature. And the cartoon is of a statue of a Civil War era general on horseback. The horse is, the chest of the horse is labeled U.S. history, and the hand that is labeled liberalism is erasing the picture of the statue with an eraser, a pink gum eraser that says political correctness on it. And the line here is, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And I must say, I can't think of a better response than that one from Joe Mandy, who tweeted, "Oh no, we are doomed to repeat winning the Civil War. Please hold me back," basically. Really just amazing that people don't realize that things should be considered this way. Oliver Willis, likewise, was tweeting the other day, just a plea for for terminology, framing purposes, instead of when discussing the Civil War, even just the history of it, and saying that, oh, well, the Union Army did this, or federal troops did that, or Union troops the other thing. Use the proper name here, the United States Army. The U.S. Army is the one who beat you here. Federal troops, that just falls in with the lost cause myth and the nonsense about this being the war of northern aggression, or whatever they like to call it down in the South. I hope that's outdated. But people clinging to these statues as somehow being the substance of history, as opposed to a memento of a really warped and otherwise pretty stupid history, that strikes me as rather amazing. Even more amazing is that it's time for another of our station identification breaks. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back from the break. This is the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. Thanks for waiting with us through the break. And we'll continue on a theme that is, of course, contemporary and on point for the week. Once again, I had to come back to the old drawing board here and get us started on a new pre-recorded show, because the president has gotten so loopy. But I do want to use this opportunity to get back into pocket and look things over for to try and bring up things that we missed the first time. I really meant to read this, and it would have been so prescient if I had brought this up earlier, but now it demands to be read. Speaking, as we have been, of the Confederate statues and the story behind them, a larger story, Adam Serwer's story from back in June. Really, I tried to do this story about 5 different times. The myth of the kindly General Lee, this done for The Atlantic. The legend of the Confederate leader's heroism and decency is based on the fiction of a person who never existed. Very interesting piece, and lots more about it since then, of course, given the events of the past week or so. But I just want to put this one on the record. The strangest part, Adam begins, about the continued personality cult of Robert E. Lee is how few of the qualities he admires his admirers profess to see in him he actually possessed. I guess he benefits in many ways, like a lot of figures from our history, and you sort of romanticize everything that the guy's ever done. Memorial Day has the tendency to conjure up old arguments about the Civil War. That's understandable. It was created to mourn the dead of a war in which the Union was nearly destroyed, when half the country rose up in rebellion in defense of slavery. This year, the removal of Lee's statue in New Orleans has inspired a new round of commentary about Lee, not to mention protests on his behalf by white supremacists. And I imagine that in June, even that late date, but in June, you probably had some people recoiling from the label white supremacists, not the white supremacists themselves, but people that Adam would be speaking to. No longer true, obviously. The myth of Lee goes something like this. He was a brilliant strategist and a devoted Christian man who abhorred slavery and labored tirelessly after the war to bring the country back together. There is little truth in this. Lee was a devout Christian, and historians regard him as an accomplished tactician, but despite his ability to win individual battles, his decision to fight a conventional war against the more densely populated and industrialized North is considered by many historians to have been a fatal strategic error. But even if one conceded Lee's military prowess, he would still be responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans in defense of the South's authority to own millions of human beings as property because they are black. Lee's elevation is a key part of the 150-year-old propaganda campaign designed to erase slavery as the cause of the war and whitewash the Confederate cause as a noble one. That ideology is known as the Lost Cause, and as historian David Blight writes, it provided a foundation on which Southerners built the Jim Crow system. There are unwitting victims of this campaign, those who lack the knowledge to separate history from sentiment. One of them is the President of the United States, but okay. Anyway, then there are those whose reverence for Lee relies on replacing the actual Lee with a mythical figure who never truly existed. In the Richmond Times-Dispatch, R. David Cox wrote that for white supremacist protesters to invoke his name violates Lee's most fundamental convictions. In the conservative publication Town Hall, Jack Kerwick concluded that Lee was among the finest human beings that ever walked the earth. John Daniel Davidson, in an essay for The Federalist, opposed the removal of the Lee statue in part on the grounds that Lee, quote, arguably did more than anyone to unite the country after the war and bind up its wounds. Praise for Lee of this sort has flowed forth from past historians and presidents alike. This is too divorced from Lee's actual life to even be classed as fan fiction. It is simply historical illiteracy. White supremacy does not violate Lee's most fundamental convictions. White supremacy was one of Lee's most fundamental convictions. Lee was a slave owner. His views on slavery were explicated in an 1856 letter that is often misquoted to give the impression that Lee was some kind of an abolitionist. In the letter, he described slavery as a moral and political evil, but goes on to explain that I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race. Ho, ho, oh my God. Yes, I think slavery is even worse for white men than black. And while my feelings are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. Wow. But okay, it's 1856. But it was wow nonetheless. The argument here is that slavery is bad for white people, good for black people, and most importantly, it is better than abolitionism. Emancipation must wait for divine intervention, like killing your entire army. That would, that to me signals it. But all right, you're waiting for thunderbolts, I guess. That black people might not want to be slaves does not enter into the equation. Their opinion on the subject of their own bondage is not even an afterthought to Lee. Lee's cruelty as a slave master was not confined to physical punishment. In Reading the Man, the historian Elizabeth Brown Pryor's portrait of Lee through his writing, Pryor writes that Lee ruptured the Washington and Custis tradition of respecting slave families by hiring them off to other plantations, and that by 1860 he had broken up every family but one on the estate, some of whom had been together since Mount Vernon days. The separation of slave families was one of the most unfathomably devastating aspects of slavery, and Pryor wrote that Lee's slaves regarded him as, quote, the worst man I ever see. Well, that makes it plain. The trauma of rupturing families lasted lifetimes for the enslaved. It was, as my colleague Ta-Nehisi Coates described it, a kind of murder. After the war, thousands of the emancipated searched desperately for kin lost to the market for human flesh, fruitlessly for most. In Reconstruction, the historian Eric Foner quotes a Freedmen's Bureau agent who notes of the emancipated, in their eyes, the work of emancipation was incomplete, in their eyes, until the families which had been dispersed by slavery were reunited. Lee's heavy hand on the Arlington plantation, Pryor writes, nearly led to a slave revolt, in part because the enslaved had been expected to be freed upon their previous master's death, and Lee had engaged in a dubious legal interpretation of his will in order to keep them as his property, one that lasted until a Virginia court forced him to free them. When two of his slaves escaped and were recaptured, Lee either beat them himself or ordered the overseer to, quote, lay it on well. Wesley Norris, one of the slaves who was whipped, recalled that, not satisfied with simply lacerating our naked flesh, General Lee then ordered the overseer to thoroughly wash our backs with brine, which was done. Every state that seceded, every state, mentioned slavery as the cause in their declaration of secession. Lee's beloved Virginia was no different, accusing the federal government of perverting its powers, not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. It's pretty explicit. Lee's decision to fight for the South can only be described as a choice to fight for the continued existence of human bondage in America, even though for the Union it was not at first a war for emancipation. During his invasion of Pennsylvania, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia enslaved free blacks and brought them back to the South as property. They were war booty. He doesn't actually say that, but I'll make it clear for you. Capturing free blacks to bring back as slaves. All the stories about, most of the Southern soldiers, they didn't own slaves. Well, you could capture them yourself, like looting a house of its silver. Any blacks roaming around, just slap some chains on them. Now you're a slave owner. Isn't that great? We don't hear much about that one, do we? Let me just read that again just to be sure we have that on record. During his invasion of Pennsylvania, the Gettysburg campaign, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia enslaved free blacks and brought them back to the South as property. Having lost those battles, by the way, retreating back to the South. But they just took people that were free and made them slaves. Pryor writes that evidence links virtually every infantry and cavalry unit in Lee's army with the abduction of free black Americans, with the activity under the supervision of senior officers. Soldiers under Lee's command at the Battle of the Crater in 1864 massacred black Union soldiers who tried to surrender. We have heard those stories. Then, in a spectacle hatched by Lee's senior corps commander, A.P. Hill, you may recognize it as Fort A.P. Hill, which still exists in Virginia. We ought to get rid of that as well. The Confederates paraded the Union survivors through the streets of Petersburg to the slurs and jeers of the Southern crowd. Lee never discouraged such behavior. As the historian Richard Slotkin wrote in No Quarter, The Battle of the Crater, his silence was permissive. The presence of black soldiers on the field of battle shattered every myth the South's slave empire was built on. The happy docility of slaves, their intellectual inferiority, their cowardice, their inability to compete with whites. As Pryor writes, fighting against brave and competent African Americans challenged every underlying tenet of Southern society. The Confederate response to this challenge was to visit every possible atrocity and cruelty upon black soldiers whenever possible, from enslavement to execution. As the historian James McPherson recounts in Battle Cry of Freedom, in October of the same year, Lee proposed an exchange of prisoners with the Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant agreed on condition that blacks be exchanged the same as white soldiers. Lee's response was that Negroes belonging to our citizens are not considered subjects of exchange and were not included in my proposition. Wow. Because slavery was the cause for which Lee fought, he could hardly be expected to easily concede, even at the cost of the freedom of his own men, that blacks could be treated as soldiers and not things. Grant refused the offer, telling Lee that government is, that is capital G government, like ours and yours. You are, after all, rebels from this government. Government is bound to secure to all persons received into her armies the rights due to soldiers. Despite its desperate need for soldiers, the Confederacy did not relent from this position until a few months before Lee's surrender. After the war, Lee did counsel defeated Southerners against rising up against the North. Lee might have become a rebel once more and urged the South to resume fighting, as many of his former comrades wanted him to, but even in this task, Grant, in 1866, regarded his former rival as falling short, saying that Lee was, quote, setting an example of forced acquiescence so grudging and pernicious in its effects as to hardly be realized, or to be hardly realized. Wow. Nor did Lee's defeat lead to an embrace of racial egalitarianism. The war was not about slavery, Lee insisted later, but if it was about slavery, it was only out of Christian devotion that white Southerners fought to keep blacks enslaved. Lee told a New York Herald reporter, in the midst of arguing in favor of somehow removing blacks from the South, disposed of, in his words, quote, that unless some humane course is adopted based on wisdom and Christian principles, you do a gross wrong and injustice to the whole Negro race in setting them free, and it is only this consideration that has led the wisdom, intelligence, and Christianity of the South to support and defend the institution up to this time. He really is unbelievable. Lee had beaten or ordered his own slaves to be beaten for the crime of wanting to be free. He fought for the preservation of slavery. His army kidnapped free blacks at gunpoint and made them unfree. But all of this, he insisted, had only occurred because of the great Christian love the South held for blacks. Here we truly understand Frederick Douglass's admonition that between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. Privately, according to the correspondence collected by his own family, Lee counseled others to hire white labor instead of freedmen, observing that wherever you find the Negro, everything is going down around him, and wherever you find a white man, you will see everything around him improving. Sounds a little like Trump. In another letter, Lee wrote, "You will never prosper with blacks, and it is abhorrent to a reflecting mind to be supporting and cherishing those who are plotting and working for your injury, and all of whose sympathies and associations are antagonistic to yours. I wish them no evil in the world. On the contrary, will do them every good in my power, and know that they are misled by those to whom they have given their confidence. But our material, social, and political interests are naturally with the whites." Publicly, Lee argued against the enfranchisement of blacks and raged against Republican efforts to enforce racial equality on the South. Lee told Congress that blacks lacked the intellectual capacity of whites and could not vote intelligently, and that granting them suffrage would excite unfriendly feelings between the two races. We'll solve that. Don't worry about it. We'll come up with that anyway. Lee explained that the Negroes have neither the intelligence nor the other qualifications which are necessary to make them safe depositories of political power. I doubt that's any truer now of the whites, of course, who elected Trump, although I might concede that they are suppositories of political power. And that seems pretty, I might be able to go along with that one. Wow. To the extent that Lee believed in reconciliation, it was between white people, and only on the precondition that black people would be denied political power and therefore the ability to shape their own fate. Lee is not remembered as an educator, but his life as president of Washington College, which later was renamed Washington and Lee, is tainted as well. According to Pryor, students at Washington formed their own chapter of the KKK and were known by the local Freedmen's Bureau to attempt to abduct and rape black schoolgirls from the nearby black schools. Another reminder that the actual heart of the peculiar institution was sex slavery. Our own personal pet theory here, but I think borne out by history. I sometimes think that slave owners fought as hard as they did to retain the right to own slaves because they were disturbed about the possibility of not having a harem of women around that they could rape at will and not feel bad about it. Stranger things have been motivated by men's sex drives. That's for sure. Anyway, so just reiterating, so the students at Washington College formed their own chapter of the Klan, and for fun, for kicks, to blow off steam, boys being boys, they would abduct and rape black schoolgirls. There were at least 2 attempted lynchings by Washington students during Lee's tenure, and Pryor writes that the number of accusations against Washington College boys indicates that he either punished the racial harassment more laxly than other misdemeanors or turned a blind eye to it, adding that he did not exercise the near imperial control he had at the school as he did for more trivial matters, such as when the boys threatened to take unofficial Christmas holidays. In short, Lee was as indifferent to crimes of violence towards blacks carried out by his students as he was when they were carried out by his soldiers. He's a real gem, he is. Lee died in 1870 as Democrats and ex-Confederates were commencing a wave of terrorist violence that would ultimately reimpose their domination over the southern states. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866. There is no evidence Lee ever spoke up against it. On the contrary, he darkly intimated in his interview with the Herald that the South might be moved to violence again if peace did not proceed on its terms. That was prescient. In other words, an early version in their minds of no justice, no peace, which is, of course, a horrible communist outside agitator, Negro, rough, raff, blah, 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 something that they blame on the left now, and blacks in particular. But ultimately, there would have no peace unless it was on their terms, when the shoe was on the other foot. Lee is a pivotal figure in American history worthy of study. Neither the man who really existed nor the fictionalized tragic hero of the Lost Cause are heroes worthy of a statue and a place of honor. As one Union veteran angrily put it, in 1903, when Pennsylvania was considering placing a statue to Lee at Gettysburg, if you want historical accuracy as your excuse, then place upon this field a statue of Lee holding in his hand the banner under which he fought, bearing the legend, "We wage this war against the government conceived in liberty and dedicated to humanity." The most fitting monument to Lee is the National Military Cemetery the federal government placed on the grounds of his former home in Arlington. Arlington National Cemetery, in case you were actually unclear on that. They just decided once they seized his home on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., to begin burying war dead in his front lawn. If you've never visited and had the tour and had that explained to you, it's worth doing. It's certainly worth repeating here. To describe this man as an American hero requires ignoring the immense suffering for which he was personally responsible, both on and off the battlefield. It requires ignoring his participation in the industry of human bondage, his betrayal of his country in defense of that institution, the battlefield scattered with lifeless bodies of men who followed his orders and those they killed, his hostility toward the rights of the freedmen, and his indifference to his own students, waging a campaign of terror against the newly emancipated. It requires reducing the sum of human virtue to a sense of decorum and the ability to convey gravitas in a gray uniform. There are former Confederates who sought to redeem themselves. One thinks of James Longstreet, wrongly blamed by lost causers for Lee's disastrous defeat at Gettysburg, who went from fighting the Union Army to leading New Orleans' integrated police force in battle against white supremacist paramilitaries. But there are no statues of Longstreet in New Orleans. Lee was devoted to defending the principle of white supremacy, and Longstreet was not. Now, we'll pause here for just a second to note there is a footnote here that says the article originally stated that there are no statues of Longstreet in the American South. In fact, there is one in his hometown of Gainesville, Georgia. And they, of course, regret the error. So, again, no statues, though, in New Orleans. Lee was devoted to defending the principle of white supremacy. Longstreet was not. This, perhaps, is why Lee was placed atop the largest Confederate monument at Gettysburg in 1917. But the 6'2" Longstreet had to wait until 1998 to receive a smaller scale statue hidden in the woods that makes him look like a hobbit riding a donkey. It's why Lee is remembered as a hero and Longstreet is remembered as a disgrace. The white supremacists who have protested on Lee's behalf are not betraying his legacy. In fact, they have every reason to admire him. Lee, whose devotion to white supremacy outshone his loyalty to his country, is the embodiment of everything they stand for. Tribe and race over country is the core of white nationalism, and racists can embrace Lee in good conscience. The question is why anyone else would. Amazingly, we saw on Thursday morning Donald Trump waking up to do some more rage tweeting early in the AM and had a series of tweets, I think 3 together here. Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Who's next? Washington? Jefferson? So foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced. Now, can you believe the gall of this jackass? Keep in mind, as I'm sure those of you listening to the show already have in mind, and if you haven't seen it, if you didn't have it in mind, you saw me tweeted about it. This is the a-hole who put a fake Civil War marker on his Virginia golf course. And, I mean, we've been over the story, of course, but, I mean, think about what he's saying here, this whole idea, you can't change history, but you can make it up. The River of Blood, do you all remember that story? I'll give you a link to, and I was using on Twitter, the Golf Digest, rather than the Washington Post, because, of course, people would say, we have fake news, we don't believe that. Yes, well, you can take it up with the, famously liberal Golf Digest. Always leaning left, those Golf Digest guys. They wrote up a story about it too. But I mean, think about the gall of this guy saying, well, we have to have our statues to teach us history. Our historical markers are the only way we really truly can remember things that happen. That's idol worship, of course. You can't change history. History is history, but you're hiding from it. Charles Pierce had a great tweet about this whole thing, about in reaction to, I told you about Condoleezza Rice had mentioned you shouldn't be sanitizing history. Charles Pierce, I think, really captured it. This wasn't sanitizing history. Putting the statues up in the first place was sanitizing history. These guys were murderers and traitors, and they should have been, they should have been drawn and quartered. Their bodies should have been ripped to pieces and fed to dogs, and we have statues of them. That's sanitizing history. Well, Lee, he was really reluctant, but he felt like he needed to serve his state. And in those days, states' rights and blah, 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 and people had more allegiance to their states. Yeah. Meanwhile, he's kidnapping black people and selling them for profit back home. I mean, he's a bigger scumbag, believe it or not. If there's a bigger scumbag in the world than Donald Trump. But Trump is faking historical markers on the golf course. And why? To make his property seem more valuable? I mean, I don't know whether it gets any scummier than that. You do remember this one. Longtime listeners will certainly remember. But maybe if you're new to the show or perhaps just joining us, like a lot of folks up in Rochester, if you haven't seen the story, you absolutely have to. I mean, basically, long story short, he's got a golf course out in Sterling, Virginia. Pre-existed there. He didn't build it. It was already there. He bought it up, renovated it. But a part of the renovations, he put up a big flagpole and a stone pedestal, and he added this plaque on this pedestal that says, many great American soldiers, you got to imagine in his voice, both of the North and South died at this spot. The casualties were so great that the water would turn red and thus became known as the River of Blood. It is my great honor to have preserved this important section of the Potomac River. And as they put it in the story here, nice sentiment. Small problem, there apparently was no such battle. I can promise you there was no such battle. He made it up entirely. All the local historians say so. And there was nothing of the sort anywhere around there. But because he thought it would give his course that much more cachet, he just made up the story. And by the way, speaking of beauty and things that are being preserved there, he cut down hundreds of trees on the banks of the Potomac River, muddying this thing up, unbelievable, just affecting soil erosion, everything you could possibly do to ruin the area. And then on top of it all, he makes up this Civil War battle for no reason. No reason at all. But try, look, if you are, I can only put it to you this way. If you are taking your cues about Civil War history from this guy who lies about everything and then fakes up the historical marker about the River of Blood just to boost the price of his golf course, I mean, I got nothing to say to you but that you're an effing idiot and you just probably don't deserve to continue to live. Don't take advice about Civil War history from Donald Trump. Please. I know none of you are doing it, but I can't think of anything worse. Smack somebody if you find out that they're doing it. All right. Well, time now for us to pause once again for station identification and for me to cool down. I'm going to dump a bucket of water over my head and see if we can get back on an even keel. Back after this. Welcome back once again to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Thanks for waiting for us to get through with our break. I wanted to return to a topic we touched on earlier. It's kind of a harsh cut off to the music there, but okay, we'll ignore that one. I wanted to return to an earlier story because I grabbed a write-up of it. I had mentioned to you about the UVA grad who was involved in the counter-protests to last week's white supremacist rally and got assaulted, was hit in the neck by one of those with one of those tiki torches. It sounds so ridiculous, but it was actually a very serious injury. I have this story here from the Associated Press and sort of mildly put up here. University librarian suffers stroke after UVA protest injury, and I don't know if that really, the headline doesn't really do it much justice, but anyway, just wanted to fill in the blanks here and give you the name, too. University of Virginia librarian, I didn't realize that was his work at UVA, Tyler McGill, was among the counter-protesters surrounded by torch-bearing white supremacists Friday night at the school's famous Thomas Jefferson statue. On Sunday, McGill was shouting down and disrupting a press conference by Jason Kessler, who organized Saturday's so-called Unite the Right rally that devolved into violence, including the death of 32-year-old Heather Heyer. And I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. It's Heyer, I'm sure you all know, but has anybody heard it pronounced? Is it Heyer or Heyer? I would like to get that one right. By Tuesday, McGill's vision was failing. He went to the emergency room where he had a stroke. He was taken into intensive care. Doctors determined that the stroke was caused by physical trauma that McGill, 46, had suffered in recent days to an artery in his neck. The only injury he suffered, according to friends, was when he was hit in the neck with a torch at Friday's confrontation. By Wednesday afternoon, his wife, Sina McGill, said he was sounding better but remains confused and didn't remember much about the injury that led to the stroke. She was out of town over the weekend and was driving back Wednesday from Alabama to see him. I do know that he had oil poured on him, that had torches thrown at him. She said he was sounding much better today than yesterday. McGill, who helps manage the stacks in the university library system, was committed to taking a stand in a peaceful way against the hate groups who rallied in Charlottesville. She said when he disrupted Kessler's press conference, photos show McGill with his arms raised. She said he wanted to make sure no one would mistakenly assume he was threatening anyone physically. He was trying to stay behind the scenes, and sometimes he just couldn't, she said. A friend, Lisa Moore, set up a GoFundMe page to help raise money for McGill's medical expenses. In less than a day, the site raised more than $75,000 thanks to a tweet from Hollywood producer Judd Apatow and other prominent supporters on social media. She said online sleuths are trying to find video of McGill being hit by a torch, which could possibly enable police to identify and arrest the attacker. Moore said she's frustrated by the assertion that both sides in the weekend's confrontations were at fault, or that people in Charlottesville would have simply ignored the protesters. They came into our town, she said. We were just defending our town. It was like a war zone, and nobody wants that. Just wanted to at least get the name on the record so you could send your money, good wishes, prayers, whatever it is you'd like to send to, I thought he really put on one of the more brilliant moments of counter-protest in the whole thing. So I'm glad to have his name in front of me now. By the way, another very important point, I think, to bring up about last week's events. Believe it or not, turning to Glenn Kessler and his fact-checker analysis here in the Washington Post. I think it's an important one here. President Trump's false claim that counter-protesters lacked a permit. Now, that was an extraordinarily dumb claim to make anyway, because it just doesn't even ring. It's just, there's really no interest involved in that. But as it turns out, it was also false. And it's hilarious given how lavishly he praised himself for being careful about things. And I didn't make a statement because I wanted to wait, and I like to have the facts. When I make a statement, I like it to be correct, okay? And I mean, nothing could be more absurd than his having said that. But, of course, he contradicted himself right in the same speech. But in this portion here, you had a group on the other side that came charging in without a permit, and they were very, very violent. You had a lot of people in that, of course, we have to put in brackets here, white nationalist group, that group that were there to innocently protest. You remember that objection, and very legally protest because, I don't know if you know. Again, I just found out, so I don't know if you know. They had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit. Well, guess what? I think you know the outcome of this one. In blaming both sides for the violence in Charlottesville that left one person dead, President Trump twice asserted that the people protesting white supremacists and neo-Nazis lacked a permit, unlike the groups that gathered to protest the possible removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who sucked in every way. But that's turned out to be false as well, according to documents and interviews obtained by our Washington Post colleague Justin William Moyer. And here are the facts as Kessler compiles them. Walt Heinecke, I'm guessing, Heinecke, a professor at the University of Virginia, told Moyer that he received a, quote, special events certificate of approval for events at McGuffey Park and Justice Park, sites blocks from Emancipation Park where white nationalists had a permit for a Saturday rally. A car allegedly driven by James Alex Fields Jr. rammed into counter-protesters, killing a 32-year-old woman on 4th Street, which runs adjacent to Justice Park. The document is below with Heinecke's address and cell phone number removed, and there is a embedded permit, which I guess, I'm sure that there's somebody out there saying, well, it's not a permit. It doesn't say permit. It says special event certificate of approval. That's different or somehow inapposite. Charlottesville spokeswoman Miriam I. Dickler told Moyer that only one permit was issued for Emancipation Park, the one received by white nationalists staging the Unite the Right rally. Might as well have said Unite the White. However, counter-protesters did not need permits to protest that rally, she said. That's another interesting and important point. Please bear in mind that people do not need a permit to enter a public park, even when another event is scheduled to take place there, nor are they required to have one to be on the streets or sidewalks adjacent to or outside the park, Dickler said in an email. At one point, the president appeared to refer to a march the night before the death at the main rally. There were people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. On Friday night, about 250 white nationalists carrying torches marched and chanted anti-Semitic slogans on the UVA campus, where they encountered about 30 students who had locked arms around the base of a statue of Thomas Jefferson, according to a Washington Post timeline. Brief clashes took place, resulting in some injuries. UVA allows access to open spaces, and so permits were not required for such marches, according to a statement by UVA President Teresa A. Sullivan, condemning the intimidating and abhorrent behavior displayed by the alt-right protesters. On Saturday, when the major violence occurred, people started gathering in Emancipation Park. Charlottesville Police Chief Al S. Thomas Jr. told the Post the white nationalist groups went back on a plan that would have kept them separated from the counter-protesters. The two sides started clashing, and by 11:22 a.m., police had declared an unlawful assembly. I think what the president is trying to say is that counter-protesters did not have a permit to be in Emancipation Park, Heineke said. That's irrelevant. He added, either way you cut it, the president got it wrong. The White House declined to comment. And as far as the Pinocchio test goes, President Trump twice claimed that counter-protesters lacked a permit to demonstrate in Charlottesville, but they did have permits for rallies on Saturday, and they didn't need one to go into or gather near Emancipation Park, where white nationalists scheduled their rally. No permits were needed to march on the UVA campus on Friday night. The president earns, it's the first thing he's ever earned, 4 Pinocchios. Okay, big deal. He cares a lot about Pinocchios. But it was good. I'm glad to see that he got that. But that was a very interesting piece of evidence to add to this, because of course he's out there claiming like the permit really means anything. Besides which, we should also take note again. Let's read this part again. They have a permit, the white nationalists do, for Emancipation Park. By 11:22 in the morning, the police have already declared an unlawful assembly. I mean, can you put that in any other terms? The assembly was unlawful. They were peacefully protesting in a very lawful way. Well, then why did they lose the lawful right? Why did they lose the legal right to stay there? They had a permit. They did the whole thing. They were supposed to have done it right. By 11:22 in the morning, the police couldn't take it anymore. It was so out of hand, they declared it an unlawful assembly despite the permit. So think about that. That never enters the record somehow. Well, no surprise there, I guess. There's plenty more, of course, and plenty more nonsense that came from the president. But let me see. I do have a couple other things I want to add to the equation here. Now, I've got to switch gears just for a second. It's another piece of the puzzle, as I promised, but I have to get this on the record because I'm afraid, I'm glad that it might happen. And I'm not holding my breath, but maybe I'm making a fool of myself by the time this thing airs. But, well, just like with Sebastian Gorka, we may not have Steve Bannon to kick around forever anymore. I really can't believe that he'll finally get rid of the guy. But just in case he does, there's some information I want to enter onto the record about Steve Bannon. And I had held it for a little while, not that long. And then I recorded it thinking I would use it in one of the earlier podcasts this week, and I didn't. But now I've got it on hand, and the hour is growing late for me where I am recording this in, again, on vacation in, where the hell are we again? We're very near Blue Ridge, Georgia, on our way, down and back up into South Carolina in a couple of days for the totality, of course. But, we have a very nice little Airbnb cabin here. It's fantastic. And, the kids are watching Rogue One in the background, and I'm running out of time. So I wanted to bring you this Steve Bannon piece. But I have to warn you that it was recorded before I got a better mix on this microphone, the one you're hearing now. And we still got some tweaks to do to this microphone. So it's a little harsh. I want to warn you, be ready on your volume buttons to readjust. But it's good information. And even better if we at some point lose Steve Bannon along the way. But these guys are never gone forever, you know. So it's best to have this on record. A lot of these Republican criminals are just recidivists. They keep coming back and back again. So let's get it on the record. It's a weird thing. It's a very weird kind of a Bannon story, one I really wasn't expecting. But I think there's something to it, and it may even give us an entree into a finishing piece for this podcast or something else to pick up when we come back. All right? So get your finger on the button. be prepared. I apologize for the sound quality, but I really wanted to bring this thing to you without re-recording it while I'm on vacation. Here's an interesting piece that I think makes good generalized discussion material. This is an August 4th piece. Sean Boberg and Emily Rauhala in the Washington Post. This is something, it touches on politics, obviously, that's why we've chosen it, but it comes at it from an oblique angle. Stephen Bannon once guided a global firm that made millions helping gamers cheat. Interesting angle on Bannon. I did see Matt Ortega tweeting about this, wondering if this is maybe the only thing that would move the Pepe-loving crowd to turn against Bannon, because I guess so much of their lives is wrapped up in gaming. But I don't know. I wondered about that. I wonder whether they appreciate that or whether they even patronize that. They seem like maybe the kind of people who would have cheated in their gaming. I don't know. Well, it doesn't even really occur to me. I'm not certain what kind of cheating is. I got a generalized idea by skimming this article just to see if it would make for good material. Let's take a look at this thing. Stephen K. Bannon had already been successful in Hollywood and on Wall Street when he flew to Hong Kong in mid-2005. That's how long ago we're talking about here. Mid-2005 to learn about more about a promising new opportunity. A startup called Internet Gaming Entertainment, or IGE, had found a novel way to make millions of dollars each month in the exploding online video game industry. Terrible industry. They had to get rid of the exploding games almost immediately. Very dangerous. Working from the 19th floor of a skyscraper in Hong Kong, the company sold virtual goods for real money. I gotta get into that business. Magical swords and capes and other accoutrements that granted video game players power and access in more than a dozen popular online role-playing games. I'm starting to get the picture of what kind of cheats we're talking about. There was one problem, though. The companies that owned and operated these fantasy games prohibited what IGE was doing and even considered it illegal. Several IGE executives told the Washington Post that they thought Bannon could help change that. Bannon agreed to become the company's vice chairman. The whole reason Bannon came on was to try to legitimize the business, said David Christensen, who was hired as the company's vice president of business development about the same time as Bannon. In the end, it didn't work. Probably because Bannon doesn't actually know what to do or how to find his way around in government, but it didn't prevent them from being bamboozled into hiring him as the company's vice chairman. Another line of work I need to get into. Bamboozling people into believing I can get you somewhere. All right. The story of Bannon's 6 years with IGE and its successor companies has remained largely unexplored, even as Bannon has become one of the most influential political figures in the White House. His affiliation with the company cuts against his current image as a crusading champion of blue-collar manufacturing jobs and as a fierce opponent of globalism. It also shows Bannon's willingness to be a part of a company that operated in what one legal expert called a classic gray market. Bannon helped persuade private equity firms, including his former employer, Goldman Sachs, to invest tens of millions of dollars in the venture, which relied partly on labor from low-wage video game players in China to earn the credits that IGE then sold to gamers around the world. I'm not even sure exactly what that means or how that works. You're paying very little to video game players who's in China, who I guess play the game to amass credits in the game that they then can sell to other people, rather than working your way up in the game. You can just buy credit. I don't know. Very weird. In 2007, however, IGE faced pressure from gaming companies, a class action lawsuit, an investigation by authorities in Florida. They don't investigate anything in Florida. And financial stress. Bannon soon steered IGE away from its virtual goods business. Probably a sound model. Oh, by the way, who was Attorney General in Florida in 2007? Is that right? 2007, do I have the date? I think that's a little early for it to have been Pam Bondi, but just curious, and who knows who it was. Armando might. Well, anyway, interviews with a half dozen former employees and executives of IGE and hundreds of internal company documents reveal for the first time how the company worked to avoid detection by gaming operators. For example, using the identities of unwitting U.S. residents to create gaming accounts and connecting to proxy servers so its activities would be harder to trace to its Hong Kong office. Sleazy. It is not clear how much Bannon knew about these tactics, which were in place before he started and continued afterward. He did not respond to requests for comment or an email with detailed questions. But moving on here, a new section called A Former Child Actor's Big Idea. IGE was the brainchild of Brock Pierce, a former child actor in Hollywood, who had roles in the 1990 family films The Mighty Ducks and First Kid. Precocious and quick-witted as a teenager, Pierce was also an avid gamer who had an entrepreneurial streak, one might say. In 2003, at 22, he and a partner opened an office in an industrial district of Hong Kong. The small office was a round-the-clock operation, its 15 employees taking orders from gamers around the world, former employees said. Pierce, reached by phone, asked a reporter to email questions to him, but did not respond to subsequent emails or multiple messages on his cell phone. For wealthy gamers, IGE offered an alluring proposition. Instead of toiling for days, weeks, or months to advance beyond the early stages of an online role-playing game, they could simply buy the virtual goods that granted advanced powers or unlocked new virtual realms. It wasn't unheard of for gamers to come to our website and spend $10,000 on a fully outfitted character in a video game, said Greg Jelniker, who joined the company in 2005 as its vice president of operations, but said he was later pushed out by Bannon. Everybody's joining as vice this and that in 2005. Very interesting. In 2004, April of 2004, according to company records, IGE took in more than $2.7 million in revenue for virtual goods for 4 popular online games, including EverQuest and Lineage 2. I am not familiar with either one. A year later, revenue for that same month rose to $6.7 million, those records show. Flush with cash, IGE snapped up competitors in the emerging industry. It moved to a sleek glass skyscraper called Oxford House that also housed CNN's Hong Kong office. It began recruiting seasoned executives from gaming and other industries who were dazzled by what they saw in the cash for credits business. Most of the companies that owned the online games prohibited trading virtual goods for real money, IGE's core business, and they worked to stop the practice, closing down accounts by the hundreds. These companies charged gamers a monthly subscription to access and play the online role-playing games. James Grimmelman, a professor at Cornell who specializes in internet law, said IGE was operating in a classic gray market, meaning that selling virtual goods for real cash, though not necessarily illegal, was not intended or authorized by the gaming companies. 4 former employees interviewed by the Post all acknowledged as much and reiterated a common sentiment that prevailed at the time. The idea was, let's take it out of the gray market and make it legitimate, Jelniker said. IGE executives thought they could do this by persuading the game companies to support the practice. They reasoned that if they showed the gaming companies how much money players were willing to pay and agreed to share it with them, the companies would drop their objections and partner with startups like IGE. Oh, okay, so Bannon didn't need to legitimize it legally speaking, so much as found forge these partnerships with the gaming companies. I don't know whether he was any more able to do that. Well, I know he wasn't able, because it says it ended in failure. I don't know whether he was qualified to try, but let's find out. Bannon became a key part of that effort in 2005. At the time, Bannon was a Hollywood financier and former Goldman Sachs banker who had branched into documentary filmmaking, which, of course, you'd think would make him completely unacceptable to the Trump base, but whatever. It doesn't, you know. Bannon's role was fundraising and eventually trying to take the company public, Christensen said. Okay, he could probably handle that, right? Bannon lived in Laguna Beach, California at the time and was also serving on the board of another company, but he took time to learn about IGE's business, Christensen said. He familiarized himself with the business pretty deeply because he was talking to outside finance groups, said Christensen, who was based in IGE's Los Angeles office. A former executive who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss private details of the arrangement said Bannon was given a small ownership stake in the company in exchange for his advisory role. Bannon began working closely with Pierce and visiting Hong Kong to learn more about IGE's operations, according to former employees. Michael Angeles, an operations manager in Hong Kong at the time, said Bannon was introduced to him in mid-2005 as, quote, a big investor who would come in and start to help with the company. At the time, Bannon was touring the Hong Kong office, sitting in on management meetings and introducing himself to the senior management, Angeles said. Bannon visited the Hong Kong operation every few months, former employees said, sometimes bringing businessmen that employees imagined might be the big investor IGE needed. We sort of felt something big was going to happen, Angeles said. The month Bannon joined, IGE opened an office in Shanghai. The new office became an important hub in the network that supplied the virtual currency that IGE sold, often referred to as gold. That supply chain was also part of what made IGE so controversial. Gold farms were popping up across China at the time, and there's a New York Times article linked here to, I guess, discuss gold farms and what they are. I'm going to open that up just to sort of take a peek at what that is about. The title of this piece is from back in 2005. Ogre to slay, outsource it to the Chinese. Interesting article. I will skip reading through the New York Times article at the moment, but it might be informative for those of you who want more background in this stuff. Gold farms were popping up across China at the time. Low-wage Chinese workers accumulated gaming credits by playing around the clock and selling the credits to brokers. The gold farms paid young workers as little as 25 cents per hour, according to the 2005 New York Times story that examined conditions inside what it said had become known as virtual sweatshops. Interesting. I mean, I could have paid my kids 25 cents an hour to farm that gold, although I don't know if they would have agreed to give away all the gold. I guess you could make that arrangement. Interesting. And there's a little graphic here about how IGE ran its virtual gold operation. There's the low-wage workers in China, the gold farmers, who played computer games and collect virtual goods. IGE bought the virtual goods from the gold farmers to sell to gamers at a markup, and then players paid IGE for the goods, instantly gaining advanced powers or unlocking new virtual realms. While these gold farmers were not under the direct employ of IGE, it was an open secret inside the company that IGE bought credits from them, former employees said. The reality is, most of the gold was being farmed in China by a bunch of guys in tiny little cubicles who played these games for a couple of bucks a day, said Jelniker, the former IGE executive, an account that was echoed by another former executive with direct knowledge of the arrangement. Our operation in Shanghai would consolidate all these farming accounts and transfer the gold to the operation in Hong Kong. IGE's growth, its entire business model, rested on a simple truth. Players in the West didn't have time, but they had money, said Lars Lien, who joined IGE in 2004 as head of customer support and worked there for about a year. The reverse was true in China. People didn't have money, but they had plenty of time. Employees in Hong Kong handled the retail side of the business, a combination of customer service in both the real and virtual worlds. Most of the online games allowed players to trade or give other characters virtual loot. I hate to cut in so awkwardly here, but it's time for us to take a station identification break with the new microphone mix. We'll be right back after this. And we're back with more of the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Of course, back with our nice microphone mix, and now about to return you to the conclusion of our segment on Steve Bannon and his cheating gamers side biz back in the day. But remember, once again, just another reminder that the microphone mix on that story, less than optimal. So be prepared. I don't think it's going to blow your ears out, but it does make for a rather awkward change. Let's cut the music out here so gently and return to our story about Steve Bannon and his role in his own kind of Gamergate. IGE employees controlled hundreds of accounts in these games and would have their avatars meet customers' avatars inside the games to transfer the virtual goods after receiving a real-world credit card payment. Bizarre. Gaming companies regularly banned accounts that were suspected of being linked to real money transactions. Former employees described a cat-and-mouse game. IGE employees were instructed to conceal their activities both inside and outside the games, according to two former employees in company documents. They did this by taking steps that would shield their locations in Hong Kong and China, as well as their identities from gaming companies. Meanwhile, speaking of gaming, I hear a couple of, the gaming notifications going off on my son's iPhone in the middle of the show. Here's, I've moved that away. Just a little thematic music, if you were able to hear that in the background. Let's see. So they're hiding their activities both inside and outside the games. They shield their locations in Hong Kong and China, as well as their identities from gaming companies. There was a lot of effort to conceal our operations both in China and Hong Kong, Jelniker said. An undated employee training presentation obtained by the Post instructed IGE workers never to type certain words in public forums inside the games. The list included IGE and names of any of our affiliated sites. The graphic included here would include IGE, My Super Sales, Yantis, any other affiliated sites, Order, et cetera, et cetera. So things that would tip the game administrators, I guess, off to the fact that you were selling credits. Additionally, IGE employees in the Hong Kong office created accounts for the company's delivery avatars using the names and home addresses of unwitting U.S. residents picked at random in a phone directory, Angeles said. Interesting. Identity theft, but not for stealing your credit, but just to have a credible sounding name and address for an account, like a burner account. It wouldn't matter. You wouldn't want to use your own account and then get caught selling credits and then be banned. But it doesn't matter if you're banned as a burner account and nobody is any the wiser. If you pick people at random, the chances that they have an account already under their name, well, I guess if they did, you wouldn't be able to register it in the game. And of course, if someone were to come on and try to register and they say, hey, I can't believe Bob Jones is already taken, I'm going to have to come up with a new username, probably not going to surprise them a great deal, unless their name is really bizarre, but even so, it might just comfort them to know that somebody else had the same weirdo name somewhere in the world. Anyway, so they picked these people out at random out of the phone directory. The company used dial-up phone service that connected to servers in the United States, making it appear that they were using computers there rather than in Hong Kong, according to Angeles and Jelniker. We were spending $20,000 a month on dial-up service, Jelniker said. I was going to say, that sounds extraordinarily expensive. There isn't a cheaper way to do that? Neither Jelniker, there is now, of course. Neither Jelniker nor Angeles recall whether Bannon was ever briefed on these measures. It's really not so much that it has so much to do with Bannon as it is the kind of weird businesses that he got involved with. And I don't know. I'm more interested in the business and the model itself. The fact that Bannon is attached to it makes it into a great a political hook of sorts. I'm just fascinated by this business. Internal company documents show why IGE was being so careful. Gaming companies were banning their accounts by the hundreds. IGE kept a tally. In a 4-week period between January and February 2006, for example, gaming companies closed down more than 800 accounts controlled by IGE, internal documents show. Even so, business was skyrocketing. By October 2005, IGE's monthly revenue had risen to $8.5 million, more than $5 million of that coming from purchases related to the hugely popular game World of Warcraft. That I've heard of. Corporate financial records show. In February of 2006, IGE and Bannon celebrated a major coup. A group of private equity firms, led by Goldman Sachs, of course, agreed to invest $60 million, according to former IGE employees. Some of the investors had doubts given the prohibition from gaming companies, but decided to jump in after seeing the explosive revenue growth, according to a person familiar with the investment who spoke on the condition of anonymity. There were issues and concerns about how owners of the games would react, the person said, but there was also a consumer reality where hundreds of thousands of gamers were doing this. We thought it was going to be very lucrative. It's wrong, but lucrative. Okay, fine. And then they probably figured, not really wrong. It's only video game wrong. Who cares about that? You know what? I think I can sympathize. Goldman's $30 million came through its Principal Strategies Group, a now defunct division that traded using the firm's own money, according to the former IGE executive. Oak Investment Partners contributed $20 million, and Maverick Capital another $10 million, according to this person. Goldman, Oak, and Maverick declined to comment. The person familiar with the investment said that Bannon gave the Wall Street investors confidence, especially given the relative youth of Pierce, the company's chief executive. Bannon was the adult in the room, the person said. You're dealing with the gaming community. You're dealing with kids. He did inspire confidence. But the company was finding little success in its most important task, persuading game operators to accept real money transactions inside their games. The biggest of their targets was Blizzard Entertainment, maker of the game World of Warcraft, which had become the largest moneymaker for IGE. Christensen met with executives at Blizzard, but they demurred. They felt, this isn't the right thing for us to be doing, Christensen said. These virtual worlds had their own calibrated economies designed around the vagaries of supply and demand for virtual goods within the game. Gold farmers upset this balance, much as a real-world government might be by printing excessive amounts of money. All of a sudden, you have way too much gold coming into the virtual economy, said Lean, the former IGE employee. You see massive inflation. It's like any other economy. For that reason, the game developers really hated this. In May 2006, Blizzard got more aggressive against what it called cheating. The company issued a news release saying that it had banned over 30,000 accounts. A Blizzard representative did not return multiple emails or phone messages. IGE and its suppliers suffered a huge loss after the crackdown, according to a notice that was posted on IGE's website in China and captured by the Web Archive Wayback Machine. Many of the shuttered accounts had accumulated virtual stockpiles that vanished when the accounts were closed. The IGE notice added that we will no longer use the term farmer to address our suppliers in any document or occasion, and we will not acknowledge or respond to the term. We will replace it with the term professional gamer. Glamorous sounding, but drudgery in reality. By January 2007, IGE's virtual currency business was in free fall, losing more than $500,000 a month, according to a lawsuit filed later by co-founder Alan de Bonneville, I'm guessing at that pronunciation, in a dispute over compensation. IGE was struggling to pay its suppliers, prompting unpaid gold farmers to protest outside the Shanghai office in late April, according to Chinese news reports. A man who said he was owed money walked into the office brandishing what appeared to be a gun, but turned out to be fake. A virtual gun, I guess. According to Liu Yang, a former IGE employee who wrote about the incident on Zhihu.com, the Chinese equivalent to the social networking site Quora. Yang declined an interview request. The turmoil convinced IGE to abandon its core business. It sold its virtual currency trading arm to a competitor called Atlas Technology Group in April 2007, according to court documents. The following month, a gamer in Florida lodged a class action lawsuit against IGE, alleging that IGE had violated subscriber agreements for World of Warcraft. The suit alleged that IGE had received tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of dollars by selling World of Warcraft virtual property or currency generated by cheap labor in third world countries. They're right, they did. The lawsuit was later settled, with IGE promising not to sell virtual currency in World of Warcraft for 5 years, course, they were quitting anyway. In June of 2007, Pierce stepped down as chief executive and Bannon took his place. Steve brings a wealth of experience that will serve the company well moving forward, Pierce wrote in a news release. In August of that year, 2007, Blizzard Entertainment asked the Florida Attorney General to investigate companies attempting to profit illegally from the video game, according to documents released to the Post in response to a public records request. About 4 months later, the Attorney General issued a subpoena to IGE as part of an investigation into whether the company was violating the state's Deceptive and Unfair Trade Practices Act, records show. IGE is effectively stealing part of the game assets from their rightful owner, Blizzard, and turning this theft into a profit, a Florida prosecutor wrote in a court filing justifying the subpoena. It's very clever. Authorities ultimately dropped the investigation after IGE turned over documents showing that it had gotten out of the cash for credits business. The case was closed in September of 2008. IGE was the subject of an extensive story that year by Julian Dibble in Wired magazine, headlined, "The Decline and Fall of an Ultra-Rich Online Gaming Empire." Bannon's tenure managing that embattled firm had just begun. Bannon steered the company, which had changed its name to Affinity Media Holdings, away from its controversial core business, focusing instead on internet chat rooms and forums for gamers, some of which IGE had acquired before it got out of the virtual currency business. Bannon became fascinated with the collective power of the gamers who gathered on these sites, according to journalist Joshua Green, who wrote a book, Devil's Bargain, about Bannon's rise in the Trump administration. Selling virtual currency was highly unpopular among gamers, and they railed against IGE in these chat rooms, putting pressure on the companies that operated the games not to partner with IGE. These guys, these rootless white males, had monster power, Bannon told Green. How interesting. So are they trying to argue here that he first discovers the potential power of, well, a bunch of dudes in their mom's basements to organize online or to share information online because they were outraged at what IGE was doing and what he was having them do at his direction? But, I mean, I guess over the course of 10 years, he transferred, his way out of that business, but he understood that you could reach these people in new and weird and previously undiscovered online channels. That's worth something. Did he have to hide his affiliation with IGE or not? And would they still care, or would they dismiss that because of their, dedication to the Trump agenda or what? I'm kind of curious about whether or not this really works to sour them on Bannon, or whether it was the case that, generally speaking, I could also imagine it being this, that in general the gamers hated what IGE was doing, but it made other gamers so angry that a sort of alt gamer, if there was such a thing, could take that perverse pleasure in angering other gamers just for the lulz, as they say in the 4chan lingo, if I'm not hopelessly outdated on that stuff. Interesting. So these guys, these rootless white males, had monster power, Bannon told Green, so he decides, let's cultivate that. Let's all become rootless white males. Bannon said he hoped to harness that power with Breitbart News, the website he ran starting in 2012 until he joined the Trump campaign last year. What an interesting shift. Affinity Media Holdings stabilized under Bannon's leadership. Bannon remained chief executive of Affinity and an affiliated company called IMI Exchange until 2011. IMI Exchange, based in Seoul, ran an auction website that allowed gamers to trade virtual goods directly. Unlike with IGE, no real currency was exchanged and no third party took a cut from the gamers. The person familiar with the investment from Goldman Sachs and two other Wall Street firms said IMI became the company's principal asset. IMI was sold last summer to a public company for $42 million, according to public documents from South Korea, about 30% less than the initial amount the private equity firms had invested in IGE. It seems to have worked out better for Bannon. Public documents in South Korea showed that Affinity Media owned about 6% of IMI Exchange when it was sold last year. Bannon's financial disclosure form for his White House job as Trump's chief strategist shows that he made between $100,000 and $1 million last year from Affinity Media, income that was described as capital gains. That is the end of the piece there. It's interesting. And by the way, it's just also interesting that such useless disclosure categories. I made between $100,000 and $1 million. There's a lot of space in there. Very interesting, and makes me think again of Matt Ortega's comment that it might actually be a huge net negative for Trump's base to find out that Bannon was involved in IGE, although I get the sense that they'll dismiss pretty much anything about their guys. That wouldn't surprise me terribly. So why do I say that we may not have Steve Bannon to kick around for that much longer anymore? By now, of course, you've likely heard the latest reason, besides the fact that he's a white supremacist and Nazi sympathizer and ought to have been kicked out of the White House a long time ago, but for the fact that he's only the second biggest Nazi sympathizer in the White House, and the other one is the president. The latest reason, apparently, is an interview that wasn't supposed to be an interview with Robert Kuttner of the American Prospect, which it's a very surprising thing that Bannon could possibly have decided to grant an interview to him, but and it's the subject of some controversy. I mean, can we take a look at, or should we just skip over the content of what became the interview and just go to the controversy? Maybe that explains it best. And unfortunately, the best encapsulation I have of that is from Axios, which, I don't like to resort to, but here it is, from Jonathan Swan on August 16th, put this together. Steve Bannon thought he wasn't giving an interview. This is a little bit puzzling, especially for a media professional. But okay, he keeps doing this. He can't figure out how this keeps happening to him. Steve Bannon's White House colleagues can't believe what they're reading tonight. That would have been a couple nights ago, of course. And here's the twist. Neither can Bannon. The White House chief strategist, and again, chief strategist and a media professional, told associates he had never intended to do an interview with an editor at the American Prospect, a left-wing publication. Largely true, right? Bannon has told associates that he admired the author's stance on China, and this can sometimes happen, and so he called the journalist, Robert Kuttner, on Tuesday to discuss his piece. Why? I don't know. Apparently, Bannon never thought that the journalist might take his very newsworthy comments and turn them into a story. It's Anthony Scaramucci all over again, minus the curse words, and we don't even know if it was really minus those. The result is not good for Bannon, who is already under pressure, with colleagues lined up against him and a president who agrees with him ideologically but tells associates he thinks Bannon is a leaker. And he is a leaker, and he no doubt is a traditional kind of leaker, but he's also a leaker in the sense that he talks to people and he thinks he's not doing interviews. I don't know how that happens. There's been various explanations put forward. I saw people discussing it on Twitter and saying he just thought he was speaking with a kindred spirit on China. Anyway, somebody from across the aisle that he could work with on China and bring some unity, and maybe that could possibly help bring some closure to the total S-storm swirling in the White House. I don't know what he was thinking about, but I could see him thinking he was just chatting with somebody and losing track of what he was giving away. But I mean, look, unless you say something is off the record, and especially if you're dealing with a journalist who's ideologically opposed to you, you're going to want to make sure that the ground rules are set. I don't buy the whole explanation, except insofar as I believe Bannon might be this sloppy about everything he does and then realizes after the fact how dumb it looked. Anyway, here is what one of Bannon's colleagues, somebody who's not an enemy of his, told me after reading the piece. And remember, the me here is Jonathan Swan at Axios. Since Steve apparently enjoys casually undermining U.S. national security, I'll put this in terms he'll understand. This is DEFCON 1 level bad. I don't know whether it really is or not, but that's what they're saying. Here are some things that Bannon's colleagues tell me bother them about the interview. An article that appears to be so well read that it's crashing the American Prospects servers. First, the liberal journalist Bannon called, Robert Kuttner, is no friend of Trump's. As Kuttner writes, I'd just published a column on how China was profiting from the U.S.-North Korea nuclear brinkmanship, and it included some choice words about Bannon's boss. In Kim, Trump has met his match, I wrote. The risk of two arrogant fools blundering into a nuclear exchange is more serious than at any time since October 1962. Bannon undercut the president's stance on North Korea, another problem with the piece. Contrary to Trump's threat to fire and fury, Bannon said, there's no military solution, meaning to North Korea's nuclear threats. Forget it. Until somebody solves the part of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons, I don't know what you're talking about. There's no military solution here. They got us. Well, that seems relatively level-headed. He openly talked about his internal fights with colleagues. That's a fight I have every day here, he said. We're still fighting. There's Treasury and National Economic Council Chair Gary Cohen and Goldman Sachs lobbying. He's a former Goldman Sachs guy himself. I don't know what he's talking about. And lastly, mentioned here, he talked about changing personnel in a way that made him sound like he's the president. I'm changing out people at East Asian Defense. I'm getting Hawks in. I'm getting Susan Thornton, acting head of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, out at state. One big question, as one of Bannon's colleagues, again, somebody who was generally sympathetic to him, asked me after reading the piece, what will Kelly do when he sees this? Nothing. Kelly's finished too. The bottom line, the piece gives Bannon's enemies ammunition at a time he's extraordinarily vulnerable. They've been saying he's a leaker and a self-promoter, President Bannon, etc. This interview plays right into their hands. Not good, as the president might say. Another item or two I'd like to add to our ending mix here, just so that they're on the record here. Trump is apparently headed next week to Phoenix for another rally. This comes at a terrible time, of course, and we really don't know exactly what's going to happen at this rally. The mayor of Phoenix, though, has said he doesn't want this thing to happen. He wants Trump to delay it. This, according to The Hill, John Bowden, writing, the mayor of Phoenix, Arizona, issued a statement Wednesday night urging President Trump to delay his campaign-style rally in the city while our nation is healing from the violence that took place in Charlottesville. It is my hope and that more sound judgment prevails and that he delays his visit. Mayor Greg Stanton, a Democrat, said in the statement, also saying he's disappointed with the president. Stanton also warned Trump against any plans to pardon former Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Yes, that also in the news. Can you imagine if those two things were to coincide? Anyway, yes, he says if he were to announce the pardon for Arpaio at this rally, then it will be clear that his true intent is to inflame tensions and further divide our nation, Stanton said in the statement. Trump told Fox News earlier this week he was seriously considering pardoning Arpaio, who he called a patriot. Is there anyone in local law enforcement who has done more to crack down on illegal immigration than Sheriff Joe? Trump told Fox News. He has protected people from crimes and saved lives. He doesn't deserve to be treated this way. Of course, he actually does. The other thing that I thought was really amazing that I don't know, did we discuss this one yet? The other thing I wanted to take note of was the editorial in USA Today, which I ordinarily would skip because it's such a milquetoast organization, but I didn't even realize they actually did editorials or have an editorial board. But well, they came right out and said it on this one. After Charlottesville, time to censure President Trump. No, they don't call for impeachment, but they do call for his censure, which is something. Several prominent Republicans took to Twitter on Wednesday, they said, to denounce hatred and bigotry in the wake of President Trump's shocking equivocations about the white supremacist mayhem in Charlottesville, Virginia. That's all well and good, but the curse of Twitter is its drive-by nature, allowing leaders to dip their toes in controversy without really getting wet. Expressing disapproval in 140 characters or fewer is insufficient when the president angrily asserts that there were some very fine people among the bigots waving Confederate battle flags and swastika banners when torch-bearing marchers chanted, "Jews will not replace us," and when police said one Nazi sympathizer rammed a sports car into a crowd, killing an innocent counter-protester. The victim, 32-year-old Heather Heyer, was remembered Wednesday at a heartbreaking memorial service. When these things happen in the United States and the president blames both sides, more formal condemnation is necessary. This is a moment of reckoning for members of the Party of Lincoln. Do they want to stand up for American values, or do they want to keep enabling a president whose understanding of right and wrong has slipped dangerously off the rails? If congressional Republicans choose the former, and history will be watching, they should join together with Democrats to censure Trump. Strong words for USA Today. I'm sure history will be watching. I don't know if they'll be watching via USA Today. I wasn't expecting that, but hey, I'll take it. I'll take it from wherever it comes. The pressure is definitely mounting from all directions. I don't know whether it's going to build to a real crescendo before we get somewhere, or before people begin to forget, or Republicans begin to back off. But it's out there, and of course it'll have its effects when Congress returns at the end of the August break. I don't know if they'll still be on the subject. Will be up to us not to let that subject go. But of course they'll be returning to their legislative agenda. That too falling apart, by the way. Glenn Thrush reporting for the New York Times, Trump's great national infrastructure program, it's stalled. Remember that a while ago we were marveling at Trump's insistence that he might decide not to work with Democrats on this thing after all. Well, it doesn't look like anybody's working on it, because there's no evidence that it's moved forward in any way, shape, or form. Not real good for a recovery from a huge disaster, huge public relations and political and moral disaster like the one following Charlottesville and his reaction to it. And so things definitely not looking all that good for Trump, which is, of course, to say the opposite for us. Things are looking fantastic. This being Friday, of course, let's wrap something up for the weekend with, we'll take a piece on a lighter note before rolling our outro music. Did you happen to see this one? This was a headline that grabbed my attention, probably grabbed yours too, the Washington Post, of course. Charlottesville white nationalist demonstrator loses job at libertarian hot dog shop. I'm not kidding about that being the headline. You would, of course, likely have seen all the Twitter activity during which everyone who was able to was trying to help identify the people who were at this march, and particularly those involved in violence. It got kind of a strange reaction out of these guys. They all believed that it was somehow either doxing, as they like to say online, or a violation of their First Amendment rights to identify them having appeared in public. I don't know what's not protected by the First Amendment in terms of activity of trying to identify them, but they never had this whole thing straight in the first place. Anyway, aside from all that, they identify these people and they report them where applicable to their employers to ask, is this the kind of person you want working at your establishment, your business? Well, I guess it even applies down to the level of hot dog shop. A libertarian hot dog shop, though, that one had never occurred to me before as even a possibility. But what do you think is in a libertarian hot dog? That's the most disgusting concept I've ever heard of in my entire life. I mean, hot dogs are bad enough as it is. I mean, tasty and all that, but try to stick to the kosher ones. But a libertarian, unregulated hot dog, I don't know if that's anything I'd want anything to do with. Try to avoid it over the weekend, will you? We'll be back on Monday with more.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thanks very much for sticking with us, not only through all of the implementation of our not commercial so much as station identification breaks, but also our vacation right in the middle of the most hectic period in history, perhaps, of this show. Thanks so much for standing with us. We'll be back and talk to you again.